Well, good evening, everybody. All 133, 5 of you, and welcome to the third lecture in this series of Centre for American Art Research Forum events this term at the Courtauld. My name is David Peters Corbett, and I direct the Centre for American Art. The Centre exists to support research and teaching in American art of all periods and very widely defined geographically and culturally. And I want to just acknowledge my warm gratitude to the Terra Foundation for American Art and to the Courtauld's own research forum who support our activities and who are, in fact, in the case of the research forum, actively doing so now as we launch these virtual talks. I also need, just before I pass over to our speaker, I also need to explain that once Professor Angela Miller, who's our speaker, has given her lecture, there'll be an opportunity for 10 minutes or so of questions. And when we get to that stage, I'll ask you to use the raise hand function in Zoom to indicate if you'd like to ask a question, and we'll get, I hope, to as many of you as possible. So I'm delighted to introduce Angela Miller, Professor of Art History at Washington University in St. Louis. She's the author of Empire of the Eye, Landscape Representation and American Cultural Politics, 1825-1875, an extremely influential study which won awards from the Smithsonian Institution and the American Studies Association. And she's also co-author of American Encounters, Cultural Identity in the Visual Arts from the Beginning to the Present, an integrated history of American arts from pre-conquest to the present day. Recent work includes essays on Rockwell Kent, Jackson Pollock, Pavel Shelechev, on whom there's an important article in the latest June issue of Art Bulletin, the Museum of Modern Art Between the Wars, and the reception of self-taught artists in the 1940s. She's held fellowships at the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts, the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., the Metropolitan Museum, and the National Endowment for the Humanities, for her book project, Countermoderns, Reason and Magic in the Mid-Century Circle of Lincoln Kirstein. The lecture tonight is entitled Facture Wars, the Expanded Field of American Art in the 1940s. And I'm now going to pass over to Angela.
Thank you, David. Thank you to you for the invitation to talk. And always thanks to the Terra for everything. I'm very pleased to be here today. This is the first time that I have presented some of this material, so I'm especially anxious to hear comments and thoughts about this work. Okay. These two images of artistic practice are only 2 years apart, but they suggest two distinct worlds taking shape side by side. A comfortingly domestic scene of three artists whose work is framed literally and metaphorically by their shared practice and by art historical tradition. I'm going to be using my cursor here, so I'll go back to that detail. They work on a small scale in a medium, tempera, that required extreme manual and muscular control and discipline. The photograph was staged and taken by their friend George Platt Lyons, who was himself a professional photographer. And like so much else in their lives, it was an expression of their aesthetic and personal convictions. I'll go back to that in a moment. Pollock's technique, on the other hand, is driven by his own dance-like movements in and around and into the white expanse of his mural-sized canvas. His mark-making is generated by an embodied sense of rhythmic gesture as he skillfully threads skeins of paint onto the canvas. But this mark-making is also conditioned by the contingencies of variable timing, the absorptive qualities of the canvas, the viscosity of the fluid latex paint, and the effects of gravity as paint poured and dripped and spattered from his brush and can hits the canvas. Pollock works with controlled chance and with conditions that he cannot entirely predict. The artists I focus on today rejected the gestural freedom, improvisational process, and break from history associated with advanced abstract painting in the 1940s. And the painting you see here is the painting that Paul Cadmus is working on in the foreground. I'm going to show you now a series of sources very quickly, which align with these works on the wall. So this is a kind of manifesto of sorts of their range of historical sources, from Piero to Bellini to Piero to fresco in Pompeii to Raimondi engraving. Drawing from a range of classical and Renaissance sources, they also turned away from academic traditions and toward enigmatic, even hermetic content. They brought to their art a tight, meticulous draftsmanship and facture, airless and crystalline light, and arcane symbolism. They painted in order to refocus distracted attention back to the underlying connectedness of things in the world. Although they did exhibit their work publicly in galleries and museum surveys and exhibitions, its allusions to queer sexuality and to the mysterious energies of nature into which they were webbed was beyond the reach of most audiences. If we overlook these different practices existing side by side in the 1940s, we reside a little too complacently in a certain understanding of that decade, an understanding dominated by the emergence of the New York School, with Pollock its most visible expression. We lose sight also of the eclecticism of the 1940s, fueled in no small part by the previous decade of government support for the arts under Roosevelt's New Deal, about which I've written elsewhere. In the global emergence of authoritarian forms of government in the late 1930s and early 40s, eclecticism was heralded within the New York art world as a badge of an inclusive democratic culture. Despite this record of eclecticism, we still read the 1940s in terms of the international triumph, so-called, of abstract expressionism in the following decade. But to do so flattens out a much more complex and interesting cultural landscape. My talk today is not meant to be an intervention into canon reform, nor into taste-making, but by paying attention to these less understood aesthetic languages, we also rattle, we unfix the determinism of our narratives about that decade. We make history strange again. I will refer to these artists as queer symbolic realists, and they are at the center of my talk today. They didn't like the term symbolic realism, but it was given to them by their mentor, close friend, and apologist, Lincoln Kirstein, who coined the term symbolic realism for an exhibition that he held in New York City and in London in 1950 by that name. But this event culminated over a decade of writing and deeply personal involvement that Kirstein formed with these artists. He had a rather tense relationship with Lucian Freud, who did this unfinished portrait, and then a photograph, kind of snapshot of Kirstein with his wife Fidelma, and Paul Cadmus, who was Fidelma's brother, actually, so he, his brother-in-law, and I believe Margaret French on the beach. Kirstein's relationship to these artists was particularly intimate. They formed part of a broader social, emotional, sexual, and artistic network, and one could almost call it, as I do in my longer study, a kind of familial network. Kirstein took his role as mentor and intellectual guide very seriously, and he would become a primary node of transmission within the network for ideas, values, techniques, philosophical and aesthetic histories. These were all routed through him and then back through the extended circle. Now, we know that abstract expressionism was explained and defended by powerful critical voices, Harold Rosenberg and Clement Greenberg most notably. Kirstein, in his role in advocating and theorizing the work of the queer symbolic realists, this role took shape through intimate friendship and in the experiences as queer and bisexual men that they all shared during a remarkable period of openness and tolerance for same-sex worlds in the years around World War II. This would come to an end with the hardening of a paranoid style of Cold War surveillance beginning around 1950. Although their practice of painting sat within an eclectic field in the 1940s, I claim for it an extraordinary level of self-understanding. This is a composite of the three main figures, and also Bernard Perlin, who will come up, who was a sort of subsidiary figure within this network. Although their practice of painting sat within an eclectic field, I claim a great deal of self-understanding and self-awareness and consciousness about their actions. They wrote voluminously in letters and correspondence and in other formats about their work. These artists programmatically integrated their choice of medium with their technical practice, their historical sources, their subject matter, and their philosophical grounding. Queer symbolic realism exposes to view a world of art making in which works and lives were inseparably bound together. These artists did not primarily make art for a market, but for one another. Art making was a ritual of daily life and the glue that held them together as a group. And the role of eros and sexuality within the field of human development was also central to their practice. Symbolic realism is often conflated with magic realism, which itself had a complicated history going back to Franz Boas' 1925, still untranslated Nach Expressionismus. Already in 1943, Kirstein had curated the Museum of Modern Art's exhibition, American Realism and Magic Realism, which featured some of the artists I speak of today. Those artists did not like the term magic realism any better than they liked symbolic realism. So I use these terms really as a convenience. But the term magic realism does at least call attention to the impact of that Neue Sachlichkeit had on both Paul Cadmus and George Tooker in particular, especially the work of Otto Dix. And this is an early work by Tooker, who was the youngest member of this network. And it has, as you can see by looking close, it has a kind of satirical quality, as well as one by Cadmus in the same year. I'll go back to that in a moment. But it turns out I found letters, correspondences between Tooker and Dix during World War II. Care packages were sent to both Otto Dix and also to their friend E.M. Forster in England. So they were very involved transatlantically with the effects of the war on their network, on their broader network. So there's a certain humor in this satirical painting about an older, much older theme going back to the Middle Ages. And also this completely obscene work by Paul Cadmus, which is now on view at the Met in the Modern Galleries, one of 7 he did for a series called 7 Deadly Sins. And that also, I think, has tie-ins with Otto Dix. So, Kirstein, and these are, I want to remind you, very tiny paintings, as you can see from the dimensions. Kirstein was a figure of enormous intellectual ambition, coupled with an oddly self-effacing character. He liked to work behind the scenes. That's where he felt most comfortable. Born into a wealthy German Jewish family in Boston, he was educated at Harvard, and this at a time when anti-Semitic feeling was part of the American and modernist grain. The subject of a major exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in the spring of 2018, Kirstein, the cover you see here for the catalog, Kirstein is now only beginning to receive his due as a cultural impresario with an erudite understanding of nearly every aspect of American culture and history, and on every level, from high to middle brow to mass culture. His curiosities and enthusiasms were unbounded by modernist orthodoxies. As a student at Harvard, he launched a literary magazine, Hound and Horn, that put him into conversation with the leading figures of transatlantic modernism, including T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, Gertrude Stein, Sergei Eisenstein, and many others. Christine also co-founded the Harvard Society for Contemporary Art in 1928, which set the groundwork for the Museum of Modern Art in 1929, an institution in which he became very, very closely involved, in part through Nelson Rockefeller, who was a good friend of his. Here he is Monuments Man. And I have to just remind you of the rather bad film that George Clooney made about this. And this little guy in the back is supposedly Christine. He got it all wrong. They got it all wrong. But in any case, here he is as a PFC, private first class. And I locate his gradual turn away from modernism sometime in the mid to late 40s to his wartime exposure as a monuments man to the massive cultural destruction caused by Allied bombing during World War II. In the years following the war, Christine's most developed ideas about the importance of reasoned choice, premeditation, and what he called general culture carried a decidedly reconstructive cast. The post-war landscape that he witnessed more than fulfilled the melancholic predictions of Walter Benjamin's 1940 theses on the philosophy of history, with its image of wreckage upon wreckage. But unlike European intellectuals after the war, most notably, of course, Theodor Adorno, Christine did not assert the impossibility of any form of aesthetic wholeness or unity. Instead, he reaffirmed tradition, the persistence of cultural languages across time. These values acquired ever greater force. In his words, quote, "In an abraded world in which almost every value, psychic and social, is tested to the breaking point." Christine wrote that he wrote that particular quote in 1975, but in 1948, he expressed similar sentiments. "Pictures constructed in awe of time, responsible to the lively past, responsible to the awful present, even into an unforgiving future." And those words carry a kind of almost biblical cadence. Christine's plea for continuity between past and present recalls T.S. Eliot's essay of 1919, Tradition and the Individual Talent. Eliot's impact on Christine was profound. For both men, modernity represented not a rupture with the past, but rather a fragmented and fallen world, the unsutured remnants of a tradition that had once organically linked together past and present. Against self-expression, subjectivism, and the overemphasis on the psyche, Eliot wrote that poetry, quote, "is not a turning loose of emotion. The progress of the artist is a continual self-sacrifice, a continual extinction of personality." Guided by Eliot and others, Christine's aesthetic conversion to a different kind of art was a cultural reaction of sorts, based in what Susan Sontag called in an essay about Christine, quote, "an exalted abnegation of self." In its place, he advocated over many decades a form of what he called impersonality, in which the artist emerged within a broader landscape of tradition, within which his own language was in conversation. Such views rejected what Christine saw as the unraveling of human and social relations under the strain of self-expression. And he would come to associate the impulsive and gestural qualities of ab-ex with a disordered psyche and a collapse of collective values. While he appears to modernist critics to be an aesthetic reactionary, I hope my talk will get you to think twice about these kinds of reflexive judgments. Certainly from the point of view of his social, sexual, and race attitudes, he and those around him were notably progressive for the most part. Kirstein, Cadmus, and Tooker all describe themselves in the 1930s as pink, in reference not to their sexuality, but rather to their communist sympathies. In other words, kind of red, not quite. Kirstein's first love was ballet, which he discovered in the mid-1920s. He was in his teens, through Diaghilev's Ballet Russe during a family trip to Europe. Modernist ballet's neoclassical aesthetic and its emphasis on impersonal discipline shaped his developing value system. Its aesthetic perfection prefigured for him moral order in the world. This is a quote, which I'll read to you. It is perhaps not too much to say that a well-performed ballet, a rite followed and executed with intense devotion, shares in some sort of moral figuration. It leaves the spectator corroborated in the hope that, despite the world and its horrors, here is somehow a paradigm of perfection and hope. Kirstein is best known today as the founder of the New York City Ballet, but he would take his devotional attachment to modernist ballet into other aesthetic forms. His convictions about the state of modern painting were most fully developed in a controversial essay by that name in 1948, which was published in Harper's Magazine, in which he targeted, without naming, the emerging New York school, and I think that accounts for its controversial nature. For someone as systematic in his beliefs as Kirstein was, there's a danger that, however, that the words and ideas will overtake the works in which Kirstein was so invested. That is surely the case, I think, with the criticism of Rosenberg and Greenberg. We tend to read the works of the New York school too much through the lens of their writing. So in order not to fall into that trap, let's look at a specific work by Cadmus that I think expresses many of the key values and practices of this group. As we began by considering, symbolic realism took shape in the years of Jackson Pollock's layered palimpsests and cryptic scribblings. This is an early Pollock from 1943. Cryptic scribblings from the unconscious. Against such work, the circle of artists around Kirstein located mind and imagination not within the archaic depths of the psyche, but within networks of universal analogy. And I want to talk more directly about this work by Cadmus from 1946. His painting, The Inventor, distills into its tiny frame many elements of queer symbolic realism. It is a work about art making. The artist at its center works within and through nature's own internal energies and processes. It is tiny, 7 5/8 by 9 1/16 of an inch. The bony, foreshortened right hand of the artist recalls Renaissance painters so admired by Cadmus. Think of Luca Signorelli, Andrea Mantegna, of course Piero, and Carlo Crivelli, all sources for him. The figure is modeled on his lover at the time, George Tooker, and holds aloft a mobile made of driftwood to which he has attached a series of scalloped shells, feathers, weathered wood, and kind of marine kind of carapace or skeleton. Oddest of all, however, is the gnarled creature attached to the mobile by one branch-like arm. Thinking about this little guy here. Situated somewhere between the plant and animal world, it invokes the medieval image of a shrieking mandrake pulled from the soil. The mandrake was associated with folklore, magic, and medicinal uses as both a narcotic and an aphrodisiac. But it also brings to view a form of sympathetic magic because it resembled other things in nature, resembled the organs of sex and generation, the testicles, and also the human torso and limbs. Because of that, it was endowed with power to affect those organs and to shape their functions and their behavior. Such linkages or analogies between human and natural worlds carried agency in this framework. By invoking them, Cadmus refers to the pre-modern type of the artist as magus, one who wields older forms of world-making knowledge. standing in front of a door ajar, opening toward a marine landscape of beach, sea, and sky, the young artist-inventor seems poised at the precise moment of creation. I'll go back to this. Conjuring inanimate objects into life. Eyes peer out of weathered wood. These figures over here. Branches metamorphose into squawking birds or snakes. There is this quality of the animation of the inanimate that runs through much of their work. Cadmus transforms the artist into a godlike creature, a godlike creator who sets into motion nature's own internal life, literalized in the image of a mobile. And he does so through a form of sympathetic participating consciousness in which the artist is a knowing partner to nature's secrets. And that's what I mean by these universal analogies that run through their work. And I thought I'd throw in this comparison with Jean Dubuffet's Magician, which is also a found object, looking rather like a mandrake. Queer symbolic realists used a statuesque figural language and other academic tools, but they turned these tools against themselves. It's wrong to think of these artists as academic. They weren't, most vocally not academics. The effect is to defamiliarize and render uncanny the elements of post-Renaissance naturalism. These works conjure a place recognized and known, but transmuted into something rich and strange. Ariel's speech from Shakespeare's Tempest was much repeated in these years as an expression of art's power to recast reality as given. But unlike surrealism, with its more doctrinaire approach to unconscious content, symbolic realism drew upon the occult life of objects, their power to guide imagination away from the received or habitual pathways of association and perception, recovering a sense of their original strangeness. We might think of this as a form of de-occultation, when something that is hidden from view by naturalism, the way in which the eye sees the world through atmospherics, through differential focus, and through everyday logic, when that hidden reality emerges from behind its naturalizing screen and into view within all of its unfathomable presence. They also turned perspective against itself. In paintings such as The Architect, which you see here, and Subway, which you'll see momentarily, they explored dystopic projections of carceral, urban, gridded spaces, constructions that exposed an authoritarian spatial system in which figures are pinioned or placed under a deadening surveillance. The Architect is a kind of 2001 Space Odyssey kind of alienated vision of urban space, which anticipates the full-blown arrival of the international style architecture in Manhattan. And Lincoln Kirstein was a very good friend of Philip Johnson, so that's a whole other episode. But I think given Philip Johnson anti-Semitism, there may be an interesting comment going on. In any case, there's a lot going on in this painting, but I do think it's a commentary on the utopian grid and also on the misuses of perspective. Subway likewise has been uses a two-point perspective system and was actually much used by sociology texts as a kind of example of urban anomie or urban alienation. Symbolic realism imbued inert or dead matter with uncanny animation. Their art was inspired by, quote, a sort of mysterious awareness of the value and authority of things. And those are the words of a friend of Kirstein's who was also a generation later symbolic realist. In this world, objects carried allegorical meaning. A late work by Cadmus, his 1959 apple peeler, is once again very small. It's 15 by 7 inches. Its scale suggesting private devotion. The 19th century apple peeler is an elegantly functional invention of intermeshing gears. Cadmus renders it in all its vaguely threatening severity. Its action of flaying an apple, and you can see the poor apple here, impaled by the peeler. Its action of flaying an apple evokes scenes of religious martyrdom, so that the work seems to straddle past and present. The white cloth draped in the back of the painting recalls an altar of sorts, or perhaps a surgical arena. The sensuously tactile quality of the objects exposes our nerve ends to the act of peeling, the sharp blade of the peeler itself, the ridges of the apple flesh down here that ripple beneath the skin, the crispness of the white linen that mysteriously covers the form on which the apples sit. Set together, these objects suggest the disciplined violence of a mechanical world as it encounters the organic realm of nature. It connects the quaint inventiveness of the 19th century back to scenes of religious martyrdom and forward to the ruthless mechanization of the 20th. Painting ensconced in folded time, still life as allegory, or as Kirstein put it, as a metaphysical exercise. At the heart of my talk today is an observation that is so common sense or commonplace that we often forget about it, which is that medium matters. The medium an artist chooses to use is generative of much else about the work and its meaning. Pollock's breakthrough poured field paintings, with all their enormous consequences for the decades that followed, that breakthrough was initiated by his move to the new medium of fluid latex house paints. That discovery opened up a new world. Do I have another? No. That discovery opened up a new world. At one point, Pollock supposedly turned to his wife, Lee Krasner, and asked her, "Is this painting?" The medium moved him before he understood its implications. But he also knew intuitively that his use of poured paint released a somatic or embodied energy that had remained blocked when he used oil. Oil put him in competition with modernist masters, such as Picasso, and he was infuriated that Picasso had already anticipated every move that he was able to make. Oil's congested, viscous properties induced in him a kind of psychic dis-ease or blockage that was unblocked when he began to paint with fluid latex. That's my own theorization of what's going on. But I think it's relevant in this context. The choice of tempera as a medium had a parallel, though very different, impact on queer symbolic realism, realist painters. In tempera, pigment is suspended in the medium of egg yolk. It required thin layers that dried very quickly and had no impasto, producing a very smooth symbolic surface. This is George Tucker's wonderful self-portrait from, I believe, 1948. This little trompe-l'oeil in the background. There's much more to be said about this, but I want to really make a technical point here, which is that with tempera, it's almost impossible to blend colors. And so shading, as you can see, and you can barely see it here, you can see the weave of the canvas, but you might be able to see the cross-hatchings that are used to build up color, because you need to, it requires a kind of knitting process or weaving of strokes on top of one another through gradual additions of lighter color applied on top of darker color to get the shading. So tempera, Chuck Close, who actually had a conversation with Cadmus about this at the Philadelphia Museum of Art in a joint exhibition, talked about it in terms of a kind of almost feminine process. And he didn't say that in a derogatory way. So it's kind of like women's work. It's like knitting or weaving. Tempera meant that you had to work quickly, but with foresight and deliberation. You couldn't be impulsive. Somatic energies had to be tightly controlled and channeled. Wonderful painting by Bernard Perlin that is actually in the Tate. And as Perlin wrote to Kirstein, this was one of the paintings that was included in the Symbolic Realism show in 1950 and was actually acquired by the Tate. Perlin wrote to Kirstein that when he switched from oil to tempera, that it made him, and he uses this kind of crazy cat Yiddish idiom, Brooklynese idiom. He said it made him paint in tinsy winsy technique. In other words, very, very small, precise brushes and brushwork. Tempera's translucency and its high value, as well as its lack of impasto or paint body, gave to it a certain chasteness, which is contrasted with oil's viscosity and voluptuous pliancy, linked to corporeality. We think here of de Kooning's statement that oil was invented to paint flesh, or Robert Motherwell proclaiming, "I love painting the way one loves the body of woman." Both statements exposed a certain heterosexist investment in the oil medium, at least for everyone but Pollock, or many of them working in oil. Oil could be dabbed, slathered, blended, and swirled, its fatty, adherent properties manipulated in ways that favored process over originating intention, reflex over deliberation, mark making, and gesture as a process of experimentation and discovery, rather than the meticulous realization of a carefully planned work. In their early careers, both Paul Cadmus and Jared French had also used a fluid painterly style, working in oil, associated with Rubens, but they both moved away from it in their mature work. And one wonders if when they adopted tempera, the tempera in a way simultaneously served and generated their mature style, that they chose to work it in tempera and that it in turn transformed the way they worked. This is Paul Cadmus's wonderful Coney Island, which has a long legacy in cartooning, interestingly. Tempera also involved the repetition of small movements in building up layers and shading. Such fine-grained painting induced a meditative absorption, while at the same time freeing the mind to wander. It brought on a kind of self-forgetting, in tandem with the devotional quality of painstaking preparation and exacting usage. Painting in tempera became a kind of creed for those in the circle. According to a friend, they talked incessantly about technical matters and about art. Cadmus compared the repetitive and regular brushstrokes required by the medium to heartbeats, as well as to breathing, which situated painting in the body while activating the imagination. Bodily processes becoming a kind of drone running beneath the hand wielding the brush with tiny repeating motions. Choosing to work in tempera called upon the artist then to act with materials rather than upon them, to cultivate a deep knowledge of the physical properties of their medium, and to subdue their own creative promptings and reflexes to the discipline of their material. And while this is true to one degree of all media, it was much more the case with tempera. You had to mix the tempera in your studio rather than squeezing it out of a tube. You had to think about temperature and humidity. You had to hold your hand steady. You couldn't make mistakes. Tempera was very unforgiving. And all these qualities drew tempera into association with older, even medieval craft practices, grounded in a hermetic understanding of how materials behaved over time, which is the basis of craft guilds as well. The tempera revival in the 20th century hit full stride with the publication of Daniel Thompson's The Practice of Tempera Painting in 1936 while he was teaching at Yale. This would become the Bible of the queer symbolic realists. But its origins in the US were somewhat earlier in the so-called egg and plaster course taught at Harvard, and which was devoted to tempera, gessoing, gold leaf, fresco, and oil. In other words, it was all about media. And where Kirstein took this course while an undergraduate and I think was first exposed to tempera there. This study of materials was also linked to concerns with the physical survival of the work of art and with the emerging science of conservation, with its concerns about the stability of materials. Used correctly, tempera was very stable, although almost impervious to physical wear. Unlike oil, it resisted the material traces of time. It didn't crack or darken or stretch or flake, but retained its jewel-like vibrancy. Sorry, I should have gone back to this. The result was a form of non-atmospheric hypervisualization. And hypervisualization was actually Kirstein's word, that seems to arrest the movements of time. Although the early 20th century tempera revival was by no means limited to queer artists, I would argue that its particular appeal for them was its persistence through and across time. It was precisely this durability that attracted them. Tempera painting was able to fulfill the role of art in connecting past to present to future because it held the effects of time at bay. For artists who did not reproduce themselves through children, it offered a type of queer futurity. Tempera allowed the artist to move their hand against the flow of time. These are Kirstein's words, against the flow of time. And in doing so, to conjure a world into being, not through mimetic means, but through magical illumination. So why were these artists so drawn to technical control and the painting process, the painstaking process of tempera? And what difference did it make that they were queer? The craft of tempera for these artists was a way of tempering, no pun intended, tempera was a way of tempering the violence of history. Cadmus reported that, quote, "I don't like painting that's too violent in its brushwork. What interests me are violent scenes that are painted with delicacy and made into an order of sorts." The careful discipline of the hand was an assertion of aesthetic control over the disordered fabric of the world. As a medium, tempera was connected to the body in one other respect. The English professor, queer pornographer, and tattoo artist, that's quite a resume, Samuel Stewart, AKA Phil Sparrow, did a series of small tempera portrait drawings of friends and lovers in which he used, quote, semen as a binder instead of egg yolk, the fluid being furnished by the subject of the drawing. Stewart's portraits, I have to try not to laugh. Stewart's portraits thus bound representation to the body of the represented subject. Actually, Dubuffet also used, Duchamp also used semen to make drawings, which some of you might know about. But these portraits bound representation to the body of the represented subject, image to person, in a strikingly intimate way. Semen portraits went one step beyond abstract expressionism. In place of the implicitly phallic energy of the expressive gesture, which offered only an enactment of an embodied process, Stewart offered the substance itself. The use of semen as binder also reawakened the ritualistic, indeed Orphic, origins of art, which they were very steeped in Orphic mythologies. Semen carried mythic potency as seed, as generative liquid, as the male origin of life. Stewart's semen tempera drawings breached the substitutive logic of modernity with an act that was directly embodied. And the use of semen also redeemed the non-reproductive nature of queer sex by granting it a space within a creatively productive economy. Semen as binder was not limited to Stewart, however. A letter from Kirstein to Cadmus expresses a desire that their mutual friend, Gier, quote, will again start to use semen in his egg tempera, as it has wonderful binding properties. Now to my conclusion. Now, having organized my talk around the aesthetic differences between two distinct forms of artistic practice in the years around World War II, I would like to end with a reflection about what they shared. During the war years and immediately after, the cultural framework of masculinity, whether straight or queer, was being challenged from many directions. self-exposure was a particular source of concern among queer men, and even more so in the following decade. This is Pavel Chelichev, a very close friend of Kirstein's, about whom he wrote a monograph, and also a sort of orbit around within the circle. And as he wrote on his deathbed in 1956, so few saw into interior of interiors, where I'm hiding always, and seeking, Kashkash, never find. And Kashkash is, of course, the name of the famous painting in the New York Museum of Modern Art, loathed by modernists. But the fear of self-exposure was not limited to men who loved men. Male artists across a wide spectrum in these years sought release from a form of autonomous selfhood that was broadly laid claim to by New York school artists and critics during these years, and yet which left them feeling exposed. We've already seen how queer symbolic realists turned to the authority of historical form, technical discipline, and intertwined human and natural agencies in flight from personal expression. They wished to establish a different scale of meaning beyond personality and subjective experience. But such claims allowed them to explore private enigmas and queer erotics under the cover of impersonality. So I'm a little bit taking apart or interrogating Kirstein's argument. The private dimension of their work, seen here in Jared French's painting Evasion in the Cleveland Museum. The private dimension of their work qualifies Kirstein's claims on behalf of such impersonality as a fundamental value in his aesthetic lexicon. In one sense, Kirstein provided them with a protective cover, an impersonal style that professed anonymity, but which functioned to camouflage the very real claims that private experience made on these queer artists. Self-disguise, however, was also a primary function of gestural abstraction, despite its claims to self-exposure and authentic expression, most forcefully enunciated by someone like Clifford Still. Pollock, we know from many witnesses, was beset by fears of psychic disintegration. He underwent Jungian therapy in the late 1930s. He struggled throughout his life with alcoholism. As I suggested earlier, his breakthrough technique of pouring offered him a sense of reprieve from an anguished sense of selfhood and a feeling of psychic isolation. And this was also when he was pouring, his initial years of pouring also coincided with he stopped drinking. So he temporarily transcended his alcoholism. His large-scale canvases with their activated fields of poured paint offered a sense of release from his embattled sense of self through the experience of phenomenological immersion, an immersion which he also felt in the natural world outside of his Long Island studio. As Pollock's example suggests, the shifting figure-ground relations that drove so many phases of modernism also play a role in strategies of concealment. Their changing relationship was not only a pictorial problem, but also a means through which to explore anxieties about self-exposure. And this was true for both groups, not only for Pollock, but also for the queer symbolic realists. Symbolic realism flattened figure-ground hierarchies associated with post-Renaissance naturalism by dispersing precisely rendered detail throughout the canvas by means of crystalline form and non-atmospheric light. I think there's a kind of, I'm arguing here, and you can take issue with this, that there is a kind of recalibration of figure-ground relations. Representationally, these paintings seem to offer no place to hide, no space of psychic refuge. But these qualities appeared in tandem with enigmatic narratives that presented interpretive puzzles involving mythic or arcanely private allusions. Along with such enigmatic or deflected content, the movement away from visual and compositional hierarchies also offered a form of concealment from self-revelation. Anxieties regarding self-exposure, in short, took different forms among queer and straight painters, symbolic realists, and abstract expressionists. But they shared the common burden of a form of masculine selfhood linked to autonomy and individuation, and that I'm arguing wore heavily on them in these late modern years. So here is one final feature their work shared, common to other dimensions of 1940s culture. Both these networks of painters turned toward late modernist forms of intersubjectivity, as it's been called. It's a very important word for me. The queer symbolic realists did so through conversations with history and through practices of building community. And intersubjectivity I use here as an alternative to the autonomous self, was a way out of autonomous selfhood. Pollock and others in the New York school turned toward late modernist intersubjectivity through phenomenological investment in the materials of art making. But that is another story. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angela. It's a fascinating talk, and particularly fascinating, I think, about technique, the technical, and the way in which those technical decisions and the implications of technical decisions can also be generators of meaning at all sorts of levels. And in that sense, you know, the expanded field is exactly the right point of reference that you raise in your title. So what we've got to do now is, I hope, Angela, you'd be happy to take questions. I think we've got about 10 minutes or perhaps a little more to allow that to happen. If I can just return to what I said at the beginning, which is to ask you to use the raise hand function and to indicate if you do have questions for Angela.